Mr. Ong Pang Boon, comrades, friends. First, may I wish a very happy 90th birthday to Mr. Ong Pang Boon. I'm very happy that we are gathered here today with ministers, MPs, activists, as well as former ministers, MPs, and activists who had served together with Mr. Ong and old friends and comrades to celebrate this very special occasion. It's a timely celebration for multiple reasons, also because this year is the 65th anniversary of the PAP's founding in 1954, and the 60th anniversary of the PAP first forming a government in 1959, and it is also the Singapore bicentennial. We are reflecting on our history before 1965, how our nation came to be, and our journey to becoming one nation. We are celebrating those who made sacrifices and contributed to making Singapore what it is today. And these people, of course, include our founding generation of leaders, to which Mr. Ong belongs. I have known Mr. Ong for more than 60 years, since I was a very little boy. Mr. Ong was then the PAP's organizing secretary. One of my early childhood memories is being brought by my father one afternoon to the PAP headquarters, which I think was then at Southbridge Road. And this must have been in the late 1950s when I was 5 or 6 years old. Mr. Ong was busy going through the records of the party members, files upon files in a room, and I remember he looked up one of the files to show me my father's party membership record. Mr. Lee had asked Mr. Ong to become the organizing secretary in 1956, after Mr. Ong volunteered to be his election agent in the 1955 Legislative Assembly elections. After that election, Mr. Ong went back to Kuala Lumpur, his hometown, to work at the Federal and Colonial Building Society. He had a good job that paid a princely sum of $700 with a possible training opportunity in England. But like the other pioneer leaders, he had witnessed the brutality of the Japanese occupation and the chaos of the post-war years. And he firmly believed in the PAP's vision of an independent, multiracial Malaya, and a fair and just society where Malayans of all races would be masters of their own destiny. So he decided to accept Mr. Lee's offer and became the PAP's first organizing secretary. In fact, the PAP's first full-time paid employee. He took a pay cut because Mr. Lee could only afford to pay him $450, which was most of Mr. Lee's allowance as a legislative assemblyman. As OS, Mr. Ong was in charge of party membership registration, correspondence with the branches, party members and the public, and the publication of Petera, the party newsletter. But Mr. Ong was much more than an administrator. He played a crucial role bridging the non-communist PAP leaders, who were mostly English educated, with the Chinese-speaking masses, who had become the voting majority from the 1955 elections onwards. He was one of the few senior PAP leaders effectively multilingual, fluent in Mandarin, Hokkien, and Cantonese. He could rally and win the hearts and minds of voters and cultivate strong ties with the branches, the grassroots, and community leaders. Mr. Ong helped to amplify the messages that the leadership wanted to convey and contributed much to the PAP's strong victory in the 1959 Legislative Assembly elections, which enabled the PAP to form the government for the first time. Mr. Lee wrote in his memoirs that without Mr. Ong, he, Mr. Lee, would have been a deaf and dumb Secretary General. Mr. Ong's colleagues and comrades found him trustworthy and loyal, and they appreciated his composure, his patience, and his willingness to listen. Mr. Ong's steady and earnest influence was most evident during the tense years of the early 1960s. We had launched negotiations and preparations for merger with Malaya soon after taking office in 1959. The pro-communist faction in the PAP began to openly oppose merger, bringing long-standing differences to the fore. When the pro-communists failed to displace the non-communist party leadership, they broke away and formed the Barisan Sosialis. The PAP was left with a slender majority in the Legislative Assembly, and later it lost that majority altogether. The future looked grim and uncertain. Mr. Ong played a critical role, mobilizing loyalists and grassroots leaders and persuading them that merger was in their best interest. His strong connections to the Chinese-speaking ground were invaluable. He was quiet and soft-spoken, but absolutely dependable and reliable. Sharp in his assessments of who were loyal in the party headquarters and branches, and able to keep the party loyalists together, enough of them to form the core of an effective counter to the pro-communists. The PAP's victory in the referendum on merger in September 1962 reflected how successfully he and the PAP leadership had mobilized the ground. For the first time, the non-communists showed that the momentum was not with the pro-communists, that the masses were not with a communist united front, that history was not on that side. Mr. Ong was critical in this battle. Singapore joined Malaysia a year later, but within 2 years, despite our best efforts, merger failed. Fundamental and irreconcilable differences soon emerged over whether it was to be a Malay Malaysia or a Malaysian Malaysia. In 1965, Mr. Lee and the Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman agreed that it was best for Singapore to leave Malaysia. The news about Singapore's separation came as a huge shock to Mr. Ong and to the many party members who had campaigned so hard for merger and then fought so hard for Malaysian Malaysia. Many PAP leaders, including Mr. Ong, Toh Chin Chai and Rajaratnam, had been born in Malaya and still had families there. Mr. Ong's family was in KL, and he had strong emotional ties with his home state of Selangor. Separation was not just a political decision for the country, but a personal decision, leaving his own family split between two countries. Like Dr. Toh and Mr. Rajaratnam, Mr. Ong had been deeply involved with the Malaysian Solidarity Convention. The Malaysian Solidarity Convention was a movement in which the PAP and the other opposition parties in Malaya, in Sarawak and Sabah had come together to campaign for a Malaysian Malaysia. In fact, Mr. Ong was in KL organizing a Malaysian Solidarity Convention event when Dr. Toh broke the news of separation to him. He was quite understandably emotional and distressed. To sign the separation agreement and effectively give up what he had fought for all his life was a heart-wrenching decision. He did so with a heavy heart, reluctantly accepting that there was no other way out. Even though separation had been deeply personal and painful for Mr. Ong, he did not look back after the agreement was signed. Instead, together with the other first-generation leaders, he poured heart and soul into making sure that newly independent Singapore survived and ultimately succeeded. He and the other old guard leaders led by example. For example, to signal that national defense was a top priority, Mr. Ong, together with fellow ministers Jek Yun Tong and Osman Wok, volunteered to serve in the PDF which had been set up soon after separation. And the following year, in our first National Day parade, they marched proudly as officers in the PDF contingent. Mr. Ong was only 30 when he first became a minister in 1959. He held key portfolios as Minister of Home Affairs, then Education, then Labor and Environment. As Minister of Education, Mr. Ong did much to strengthen our education system. A particularly delicate task was to move students towards bilingualism. Mr. Ong had to increase the teaching of English in the Chinese schools and the teaching of Chinese in the English stream schools. But for the fact that he himself was effectively bilingual and well respected by the Chinese-speaking community, this move would have faced much greater resistance. The Ministry of Education also had to imbue the younger generation who are now growing up as Singaporeans with a new national consciousness. The ministry introduced flag-raising ceremonies in schools and the recitation of a pledge. Singaporeans know that Raja drafted the English pledge. But it's not so well known that it was Mr. Ong who had come up with the idea of a loyalty pledge to be taken by students to inculcate national consciousness and patriotism. He wrote to Raja to explain this and sent some initial drafts of the pledge by MOE staff for Raja's comments and amendments. Raja worked on the drafts, took some time, and proposed a version which Mr. Lee Kuan Yew subsequently amended to become the English pledge we have today. After the English text was settled, Mr. Ong then personally amended the Chinese translation to produce the final Chinese version of the pledge. And so, on the 24th of August, 1966, school children all over Singapore, including myself, recited the pledge for the first time before the national flag. Since then, generations of young Singaporeans have learned the pledge by heart and internalized what it means to be a Singaporean. What started as a loyalty pledge for school children has now become the national pledge for all Singaporeans. I've only mentioned a few of Mr. Ong's most salient contributions as a member of our founding cabinet. He was one of the old guard who laid the basis for Singapore's survival, sovereignty, and eventual success. In his long life, Mr. Ong has witnessed firsthand how Singapore progressed from third world to first. As an important participant himself in the big events surrounding our country's birth, then later on, watching his successors build on the legacy that he and his colleagues had handed on to them. And in 2015, attending our Jubilee National Day Parade as one of the 10 Singapore signatories of the separation agreement, knowing that his work had stood the test of time, endured, and flourished well beyond the founding generation. Mr. Ong's contributions and those of the first generation will never be forgotten. We owe them an incalculable debt of gratitude. On behalf of all of us, Mr. Ong, thank you for your lifetime of dedicated service to the PAP and for your many illustrious contributions to Singapore. My colleagues and I have done our best to build on these foundations, to live up to the ideals of the founding generation, and to improve on what we have inherited. Soon we'll be handing over the baton to the next generation, and I'm confident that they too know how precious a legacy they will be taking charge of, how heavy their responsibility is, and how carefully they must steward the precious treasure that is Singapore. So I wish Mr. Ong many more happy and healthy years ahead. He continues to use the gym, you may or may not know, in Parliament several times a week. And I wish him a very happy birthday and many more good years to come. Thank you very much.